agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, political and policy analyst, Kristen Matheny.
Hey, Mike, how you doing?
I am doing okay. How about you, Kristen?
I'm good. We're dealing with some bad weather here in South Florida, but other than that, I mean, that's the summer story, right?
Yeah.
But other than that, we're doing okay.
Definitely. Well, it's been a while, and I am really happy to be doing the show with you again. But before we get to our show, we want to thank a few people, our newest Patreon supporters, Brent and Maggie, and also a huge thanks to Don, who's a longtime listener and supporter who recently, in addition to his regular monthly support of the show, gave us a pretty significant contribution through Venmo. And he wrote in after he did that, and he said it was in honor and recognition of the absolute fine job that you and the rest of the team do on the Politics Guys podcast, and in recognition of the fact that I appreciate you guys even more today than when I first signed up as a supporter, and in recognition of my opinion that this country needs you and the podcast now more than ever, which I thought was really nice. And then he included this P.S. Tell Jay I said, and even you, Jay. and then in a later email, he added, I got to give Jay a shout out. The last bonus show was some of his best stuff. And even though I disagree a lot with him and find myself telling him to stop talking sometimes, he is an effective counterbalance to have in my life, even when I want him to stop talking. Good job, Jay. I respect you and 20% agree with you, and I'm glad you're on the show. So it's not all hating on Jay or conservatives or anything like that, even though we know, and you know, Kristen, that our audience is definitely leans more to the left. You and Jay, you and Jay kind of are our right flank, really, with Trey being like a not quite a former Republican, but, you know, kind of searching for that. So we really appreciate that. And of course, when you're a Patreon supporter, you get that second full-length episode every week, which now, I should point out, we are releasing at the same time as our regular available to everyone episode. We got a lot of feedback on that when we started it last week, and it was pretty much all positive. So we're going to continue to do that. And as always, if you would like to get that second episode, but you can't afford to support the show financially, totally not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you all set up. Now, today we are going to be talking about a bunch of stuff, and I'm sure a lot of it will spill over into that second show, like politics and policy surrounding COVID, of course, unfortunately, particularly in Florida, where Kristen has a specific interest, the Senate's adoption of that $3.5 trillion budget blueprint, the 2020 census data release, the IPCC climate report, the Taliban just tearing through Afghanistan, and the U.S. response, or lack thereof, to their startling success, the resignation of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, Amazon, and biometric scanning, scary stuff. And as usual, whatever we don't get to on the regular show, like I said, we'll hit on that bonus show, which we'll release at the same time. But before we get to any of that stuff, we're just going to take a quick break, and we will be right back to start things off. Okay, Kristen, so I thought we'd start off in, well, your sort of backyard, as it were, with the situation with Florida and Governor DeSantis, although I think it's more broadly applicable to a number of southern states. But why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. So just to kind of give a recap, earlier this year, Governor Ron DeSantis here in Florida banned proof of vaccination, otherwise known as vaccine passports, for private businesses. So, you know, public opinion has really been split on this decision. There's been a lot of back and forth, especially recently during the past week. Other states have enforced similar bans. Some are more restrictive, some less restrictive. yeah, just it's kind of all over the map, all over the country. So over the past week, kind of in conjunction with that, over the past week, with kids returning to school, there's been this really big focus, kind of an expansion of that, states and governors implementing or not implementing mask mandates and school districts defying those executive orders. So obviously, that comes into play here in Florida. There's been an executive order to basically not enforce mask mandates in certain school districts, or in all school districts here in Florida. And just to be clear, this executive order does not prohibit mandates outright. I think there's a lot of misinformation there out. But the decision-making powers basically being given to parents and guardians, which essentially allows for opt-outs. So, of course, on everyone's minds, kind of, I guess, the moral of this story is the political scope of all of this. So, there's a lot of talk. Republican governors like Ron DeSantis and, of course, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas, they're the subject of a lot of conversations regarding like possible presidential runs, senatorial runs. And these issues have, because of that, these issues have become really polarizing. Again, we're always talking about COVID and politics intertwined, and this has made people even more polarized. So, yeah, kind of a lot of bullet points to talk about here. But basically what we're talking about is everything going on with COVID this week, leading up to this week, obviously back to school, things going on here in Florida, concerns about the Delta variant, mask mandates. And of course, I'm in the epicenter of all of it here in Broward County, Florida. If you've been following the news, there's a lot of conversation about Broward County in particular. So before I talk, I definitely wanted to get your opinion on this, Mike. So what do you think?
Well, I guess the place where I want to start, or where I generally start, is with the actual data. And the data to me is pretty concerning. I just pulled up right now the latest data on the hospitalized per 100,000 rate. And the U.S. average is 22. Number one in the country in states is Florida at 69. Which is, this is pretty concerning, because if you're sick enough to be hospitalized with COVID, obviously it's more than just cases. But the next four in the top five: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas. I mean, there are some connections there, right? They're all deep. They're all red states with Republican governors. And so, that's one thing to point out, that this, is a big deal in certain states, particularly Florida. And also, I think it's important to point out that pediatric COVID cases are significantly on the rise in Florida, though we don't have great data on this because, and I don't know why, but as of June 24th, the Florida Department of Health stopped reporting child COVID hospitalizations. I don't know why. I maybe have suspicions, but I won't go there because I don't know why. But to give people a snapshot at just one hospital, Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital in your county, Broward County, there were just over 20 kids with COVID treated in that hospital in June. Around 240 in July, and in just the first 10 days of August, they've treated 160 kids with COVID, which, if you extrapolate it to the end of the month, would be 480 for the month, a doubling from July. And that's pediatric COVID, which I think is particularly of concern with kids going back to school very shortly, and the fact that, the kids 12 and under can't get the COVID shot that's not authorized, the vaccine. And we're seeing these cases serious enough to be hospitalized or go to the hospital on the rise. And so, to me, this idea that, this is just not a big deal and, well, kids can't get it or kids can't get really sick from it, the data, I think, suggests otherwise. And so I guess I wanted to get your take on the seriousness of all this, what you take away from especially like Florida versus the rest of the country on this, given that is, right where you're at.
Well, I think there are a lot of topics here that we can cover. So when it comes to the concerns of parents going back to school, Broward County has famously, or I should say the Broward County School District has famously, rejected Ron DeSantis's executive order, basically prohibiting these mask mandates. And of course, it's not total prohibition, because there are several counties in Florida that have made adjustments to this. They've allowed for opt-outs. Broward County is not allowing for opt-outs. About a week ago, the county actually voted to allow for these opt-outs and to go along with this executive order. And then this week, I believe these, of course, I'm here in Florida, but I assume this made national headlines. Broward County chose to basically backtrack in light of all of this information. So I think one of the issues that has come up is Florida is sort of the epicenter of the Delta variant, but also Florida's been the epicenter of a lot of shady reporting of that COVID data. So 2 weeks ago, the CDC actually, I should say a week ago, the CDC actually had to backtrack with some of their Florida numbers. They had reported, I think, a little over 28,000 people, new cases had developed in the state of Florida, and they basically backtracked it and said that it was actually closer to 15,000. It was a little over 15,000 people. So I think part of the conservative backlash here in the state of Florida is that we can't seem to get the statistics right. And likewise, we can't seem to get a good number when it comes to reporting pediatric data too. So I am aware that, the Delta variant is something that is very real. It's something that's on the forefront of people's minds. But I think there's a lot of mistrust here in Florida just because of everything that's happened, especially over the last couple of weeks. There have been quite a few developments there. And, I think a lot of parents are starting to, question the political motivations. More progressive parents are questioning the political motivations of Ron DeSantis. Obviously he's trying to stake his claim on the Republican Party. I think, I personally think he's vying for making a presidential run. I think he's, trying to put his name in the minds of Republican voters. It seems to be working in a lot of cases. He's very popular amongst Republicans, very, very popular. He's actually the front runner to run on the Republican ticket in 2024. So I do think that there are, ulterior motives there, obviously. But on the other hand, I think that, more conservative parents, myself included, are questioning this data just because it seems to change so rapidly. The CDC has, recently backtracked some of that data. So I think there are obvious concerns, but there's a lot of hesitation to kind of mandate one way or the other. And obviously, there are a lot of concerns with masks causing problems in terms of like psychological damage to children. It's kind of this unspoken problem. And it's not just in Florida, it's around the world. Other, governments around the world have expressed concerns about, the trauma of kids wearing masks, delays in terms of like increasing phonetic skills, especially amongst younger kids. There are a ton of concerns. It's almost like too much to talk about, but there are just so many concerns about wearing masks going one way or the other. And I think here in Florida, the eyes of the nation are upon us. And, certainly here in Broward County, we're feeling the pressure. So I don't know, kind of a summary, I guess.
Yeah, well, on the data thing, it seems to me, well, you can just pull Florida's state data, which I'm looking at right now. And when I look at the weekly positivity, when I look at the weekly deaths, it tells the same story. And so it seems to me that people who say, well, we don't really, the fact of the matter is we know, number one, that data from, say, Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital, those are real kids, and that these are real increases. And I think the argument that, well, we're not sure about the data, so let's just, that these are people's lives who are being impacted, and in many cases, lives are being lost. And I feel like it's very convenient for some people who are just anti-mask or anti-vaccine to say, well, the data is a little, well, yeah, okay, we can argue around the edges at that maybe. But what we do know is that Florida is absolutely at the national epicenter, and arguing 1 or 2%, either way, it seems to me that that's a side sort of argument that gives people a convenient excuse for saying, well, you can't trust the government. Is it 18%? Is it 17%? Whatever. Do you see what I'm saying there?
I do, but we're not talking about a difference of 1 or 2%. We're talking about a difference of of 28,000 versus 15,000. That's a huge discrepancy. That's almost half of the number of COVID new cases, basically, thrown out. And I think, if it was a difference, and we've talked about this before, if it was a discrepancy of 1 or 2%, I think that's worth consideration. But, when it, I guess to another point you made, when it comes to masks, I'm not arguing for masks or against masks. I actually don't see it as a political issue. I see it as very much a personal issue. But there have been a lot of studies that have shown. The Wall Street Journal just reported earlier this week that I believe it was a major study coming out of the Mayo Clinic. It may have been somebody similar. I can provide that, and we can post it, I guess, with the notes for the show. But basically, masks are the fourth most effective way to reduce the transmission of this virus. They're the fourth most effective way. Far more effective is, for example, social distancing. I believe that was number 2. So I guess what concerns me is, like, here in Broward County, I'm obviously concerned about COVID. It's something that's on the back of my mind. But here in Broward County, when it comes to schools, my kids' school announced that they will not be abiding by social distancing. They will be abiding by the mask mandate, though. It seems to me that in this case, I feel like there's not enough consideration for some of the data that's coming out regarding masks and the wearing of masks, whether you're pro-mask, whether you're anti-mask. I think regardless, there are other methods of reducing transmission of COVID that are far more effective, such as social distancing. And I think that's worth consideration when it comes to what's going on in schools in particular.
Yeah, and I certainly agree. And it just makes sort of common sense that social distancing would be more effective, right? But I think the problem, and from an educator standpoint, is that there simply aren't the facilities to bring everyone back in the class, because anyone who's been in a classroom know that people are kind of pushed together pretty tightly, and there are just classroom size constraints. And so you can't actually have the in-person sort of experience that I think rightly so many people last year said it was really, there were some serious consequences to not having that. And so to me, it's a question of, well, what can you do? And you do the best thing you can do to kind of balance the risk. And social distancing is a lot more difficult to do with in-person education. I mean, you can do a little bit of it. I know certainly when my classes start in 2 weeks, I'm going to try to get the students to sit as far apart as possible, but we're limited by classroom size. Whereas with masks, everyone can have access to a mask and put a mask on, and it may be the fourth most effective thing, but it's certainly more effective than nothing at all. And the other point I wanted to make is on the discrepancy in the case count. To me, since the beginning, the new case data is perhaps the least indicative to me, I don't want to say least important because it sounds like I'm minimizing it, but to me, there are a lot of problems with looking at the severity of COVID in an area just by people who happen to test positive for a lot of reasons. But that's why I always look to hospitalizations, because that's a much firmer sort of, a more solid sort of thing. If you are sick enough to go to the hospital, deaths, of course, would be another thing. And so I don't even look really at new case data for those reasons, but I look at hospitalization rates, and I think there's not really that controversy there, because it's a lot easier to kind of count and understand that sort of thing. And when you look at that, again, that's why I mentioned that for Florida. Florida per capita by far exceeds any other state in the country. And I think it's sort of hard for people to not look at that and not look at those top 5 Southern Republican-dominated states in hospitalizations per capita and not say, isn't it reasonable to posit some correlation between what people are hearing from political leaders and the actions that political leaders like DeSantis and Abbott and some others are taking, and that hospitalization rate? And shouldn't that be a reasonable thing for concern?
I think it is a reasonable thing for concern. I mean, I'm not trying to argue that it's not. I think, even for the most, adamantly opposed anti-maskers. I was talking to a friend of mine earlier this week, and she made a comment that everybody knows someone. At this point, everybody knows someone who has been impacted in some way, either secondhand or firsthand by COVID, somebody who's been hospitalized, or maybe even somebody who has, been seriously ill or died from COVID. And I'm no exception. I do know people who have been, heavily, I think all of us have felt the impact in some way, whether that was economic, whether that was just in terms of, living our lives, whether we feel like our personal freedoms were, I guess trampled upon, or, whether we've been infected by COVID ourselves. I think all of us have felt that. So I think it's accurate to say that, yeah, I look at the data too. The numbers are going up. I think there are lots of reasons why those numbers are going up. I'm not going to say that it's going to stop necessarily, or change in any way if we wear masks, if we don't wear masks. I agree with you that masks reduce the transmission. I don't think they're the most effective way. In fact, I don't think they are, obviously there's fourth most effective way according to this one study, but, I've questioned the efficacy of masks in the past, but, I wear a mask. I know that it makes people feel better when I wear a mask. I know that it reduces the transmission of not just the COVID virus, but other viruses. If I wear a mask. So yeah, I wear a mask, and yes, numbers are going up. That being said, I think that there are a lot of other issues in play here in Florida with Governor DeSantis. Like I said, he's obviously kind of positioning himself for this presidential run. He's trying to be at the forefront of the minds of Republicans. I think there are issues of personal freedoms that are worth talking about. I think a lot of us who make those arguments tend to get poo-pooed a little too often. But I think there are some genuine concerns about how long will this last. If we take these measures, if we, allow government to, take that choice away from parents, what other choices will be taken away from parents? I know you probably don't like the slippery slope argument, but I'm not presenting it as my argument. I'm presenting it as something that is legitimately in the minds of a lot of conservatives, particularly here in Florida. This is what I'm hearing. It's not my favorite argument either, but it's what I'm hearing. And I think these are legitimate concerns. You see data, you see a lot of backtracking of that data. You see a rise in the hospitalizations. I remember when this happened, it was a roller coaster last year. I remember things started to get better in the fall, and then they shot back up again. In January, we had the highest numbers here in Florida, and I think across the nation, than that we had all year long for the full calendar year prior. So, I anticipate that will happen again, especially as, things start to relax, things start to return to normal in some parts of the country. And here in Florida, businesses are opening. I think you will see a spike in COVID. I think you'll see a spike in a lot of things. I know a lot of people have been hospitalized. I know 2 people who have been hospitalized here in Florida with RSV, which is being transmitted heavily right now because we're starting to loosen our restrictions and we're starting to not wear masks. I guess ultimately a lot of people wonder, where does this stop? When we stop wearing masks, viral infection will inevitably go up. So, what do we need to do to stop that from happening? And can we even stop it from happening?
And I think what a lot of people, especially on the left, say is, well, yeah, what we do is we get as many people vaccinated as possible. And, for me, if I were the governor of any particular state or any random state, I suppose, once the FDA fully approved one of the vaccines, which looks like it's going to happen with the Pfizer vaccine starting probably sometime in early September, I would be completely comfortable with a vaccine mandate along the lines of where a lot of school districts, a lot of states, most of them, I would say just about all of them, have requirements that you need to be vaccinated for other things that are fully approved by the FDA, the vaccines, before you can send your kid to school for public health reasons. And so to me, that seems like the most, because that's going to be the most effective thing, certainly. And obviously, kids under 12, it's not going to be approved yet. But that to me seems like the reason, of course. But what Governor DeSantis seems to be doing, things like, for instance, threatening to take the salaries away, right, to not pay school superintendents and school board members and impose mask mandates, or even more, for someone who's, say, free market conservative, saying that private businesses in Florida are not free to impose mandates or not, or vaccine proof of vaccine if they want. It's like, wow, what an incredible government intrusion into private business, private enterprise, which seems to fly in the face of traditional conservative economic principles. And so it seems to me that Ron DeSantis, like a lot of sort of Republican populists, isn't really much of a conservative. He's just somebody who's just grasping on to whatever sort of doctrine might get him into the White House, and damn the consequences.
This was actually a concern of mine when all of this, this executive order first started making headlines. I believe it was like back in early May. Governor DeSantis, started talking about, banning the vaccine passport. And I actually did think, I read an article, I believe, in The Economist back then, and it was about the ramifications for private businesses. Is this going to impact private business? It made the same argument you did, asking a lot of questions. Is this going to cause problems in terms of businesses, being able to exercise their right to, like, quote unquote, keep their patrons safe? Is this going to impact businesses requiring their employees, for example, to get vaccinated? I think that argument is valid, very, very valid, actually. But I think that from the conservative perspective, there's an argument to be made about personal freedom. And it's funny because I say it and I can almost see, the more progressive listeners rolling their eyes. Oh, you've heard enough about personal freedom. I'm saying this again because it's a huge concern in the minds of a lot of conservatives. If we start mandating vaccine passports, for example, domestic travel, so in order to get on an airplane, you have to have a vaccine. I think that, flies in the face of, for example, this progressive claim that the vaccines are effective. We were talking 6 months ago about the fact that this vaccine was being billed as prophylactic. It was billed as something that was preventative to prevent COVID. And I feel like the goalposts have moved over the last few months. It's not a prophylactic. The CDC has come out and said it actually just, decreases some of the symptoms, or, it makes you more likely to be able to resist the virus, but it doesn't make you completely able to resist the virus. And, again, the data is changing. We're going to talk later on about the efficacy of the Moderna vaccine versus the Pfizer vaccine. And I think there are a lot of people who have legitimate concerns about this and about personal freedom. I mean, I guess I have kind of a mixed opinion about it. The vaccine passports are not something I'm in favor of for reasons, that pertain to personal freedom, and also just the idea that something so authoritarian could be implemented, but that's not to say that I don't think that it could be a requirement for kids going to school and for travel in the future. Right now the vaccine is in its experimental stages. There have been no long-term trials. I've said to just about everyone I know, I'd be willing to take the vaccine once I see the results, once there is some data. I think a lot of conservatives feel the same way I do, that it's really a personal, deeply, deeply personal decision and not so much a political one. But that being said, Florida is the epicenter, and I'm seeing what's going on here. I feel like, there is a lot of talk about protecting personal freedoms. It's going on here. I'm also concerned about access to the vaccines, especially amongst minority populations. I mean, you probably know this, and a lot of our listeners probably know this, but the populations of the United States that haven't received the vaccine by the largest percentages tend to be minority populations. There's also a lot of vaccine skepticism in some communities. So there's also the issue of disproportionate vaccination and, kind of dealing with that. Will it be will vaccine passports be essentially discriminating against certain groups of people because of these ideas and, because of their reluctance to get the vaccine? So, I mean, there are so many issues when it comes to the vaccine passport.
Yeah. And that's not something that seems to be on the horizon, but wouldn't you say there's a distinction between government potentially doing something like that and, in the case of Florida, the government, again, saying to private businesses, we are going to tell you how you can and cannot screen people for what you can do or not. I mean, you talk about freedom. Isn't that a violation of freedom? Based on core sort of economic freedom, business freedom principles, shouldn't Norwegian cruise lines or what have you be able to decide what their health policies are, and what right does government have, especially if you're a conservative, to dictate to them what sort of health conditions they can put on? I mean, isn't that a freedom issue?
I totally think it's a freedom issue. I started off by saying that was my biggest concern when this happened back in May. That one of my biggest concerns was the issue of free market policy, and the fact that, all of a sudden you had private businesses like Norwegian Cruise Line, like a lot of cruise lines. I mean, that was kind of the first conversation we had when we talked about, private businesses not being able to mandate these vaccine passports. Obviously that's a concern. My other concern, though, is whether or not this will trickle over into employers mandating employee vaccinations, which, I think presents a whole other host of issues. So I think, I know the slippery slope argument isn't a popular one, but I know that that's what a lot of people are thinking. Is this going to be a situation where, people who don't get the vaccine will be discriminated against? Will they be disproportionately affected depending on the communities that they live in? And will employees be discriminated against
Let's hope so. I mean, on the left, that's exactly what we're saying. I mean, I'm all for what Warner Media, United Airlines, Hawaiian Airlines, Microsoft, a whole bunch of other companies are doing, and saying that, yes, we will in fact discriminate against you if you don't get the vaccine. We might impose all kinds of conditions. We might just say that you can no longer be employed, that a vaccine is a condition of employment. And that, to me, it seems is perfectly within the rights of private businesses to say, we have certain conditions of employment. You have to do certain things. And if you don't like it, go find a job elsewhere. And to me, that's a very positive trickle down sort of thing. That's a slippery slope. I hope, I would love to see Amazon and Walmart, the two biggest employers in the country, get on. And if they really haven't, they've gone more with carrots instead of sticks, offering various incentives. Amazon's doing like a lottery thing, and Walmart's actually paying employees $150 to get the vaccine, which is up from $75, which they had been doing. So I'm glad the Biden administration is meeting with these companies and encouraging this, not mandating it, but encouraging it. And I hope that more and more employers do that. And because for most people, the vaccine is widely available. Now, I would have an issue if an employer mandated a vaccine and it happened to be more difficult for some employees to get it. And they were, had a reasonable case to say, well, I'd get it, but I can't, it's not available. But I think in almost a small number of cases, that's not true. And so I want to see more companies doing this. Absolutely.
What about opt-outs? I see a huge potential problem there when it comes to opt-outs with people who, for example, I'll give you a really good example. So I have a friend who's a nurse. And he works in a hospital not far from my house, and he has a heart condition that basically kind of eliminates the possibility of getting the vaccine. His doctors have advised him not to. His cardiologist has advised him not to. His hospital his hospital group, I should say, mandated the vaccine, and he was able to get an opt-out. What about a situation like that? What about religious opt-outs? I foresee a lot of problems here when it comes to opt-out.
I'll say absolutely. If there's a legitimate medical reason for an opt-out, I would certainly support that. But religious or ideological reasons, no, not at all, because this is a public health issue. And so I say that overall public health trumps that sort of reason. But if there's a legitimate medical reason, I 100% am okay with that.
So you don't see a potential legal issue when it comes to religious exemptions from this vaccine?
I certainly see that argument being made, absolutely. And I think that there's a balance to be considered with that, certainly. But I think ultimately that the balance needs to come down on the side of public health. And so, yeah, it's a legitimate question to raise, a religious freedom question. But I think ultimately it's, kind of along the lines of, well, what if this is a more extreme example, my religion says that I can take intoxicants. Well, sure, go ahead and take intoxicants, but you can't be a bus driver and be, intoxicated or something like that. So if people don't want to get the vaccine, then I think that it's reasonable to say that, well, if so, then you have to undergo a lot more things like, and this is maybe a way to, I suppose, split the difference in a sense, because I know certainly for government employees in some instances, I believe how it works, I think, is that federal employees who refuse to get the vaccine because there is that mandate, then they have to get like weekly testing and masking, and there are travel restrictions. And that to me seems to be at least some way to sort of deal with that. So I think there is some room to kind of work at this on the edges. But I think a lot of people who aren't getting the vaccine are just not getting it for just some sort of hazy sort of ideological personal freedom sort of thing. And, I think we've just generally speaking as a country gone too far in that direction and have forgotten that we focus so much on our rights and our freedoms as individuals, but we forget about our responsibilities as members of a community. And I think we have suffered in this, certainly, and in so many ways because of that.
Yeah, I disagree with you. I do think that those fundamental freedoms and those personal freedoms are incredibly important, and I think they need to be a part of the conversation. And I think that a lot of people, not just people on the right here in this country, but a lot of people around the world have concerns about, like I keep saying, the slippery slope, but also, the idea of government overreach. A lot of parents are concerned about overreach when it comes to children not being able to make decisions for your children. At least, mandated a vaccine with the possibility of an opt-out for things like, religious and ideological reasons, for, legitimate medical reasons and things like that. I think there are so many questions that we still have to answer about COVID. There's so much we don't know. And I think there are a lot of questions that people are legitimately asking about the efficacy of these vaccines. mRNA technology is very controversial. And I think a lot of people are concerned about, the data that's coming out, the changes in the data. Like I said, we're going to talk about the efficacy, the discrepancy in the efficacy numbers of like the Pfizer vaccine. It's the moving goalposts in terms of, it's a prophylactic. No, it just lessens the symptoms. Well, maybe it, prevents the virus, but only to this extent, I just, I've said again and again and again, I'm not anti-vaccine. I think, most people on the right are sort of just put into this group by people on the left as being, we're all anti-vaxxers. We're not. Most people I know have received the vaccine regardless of their politics. I just view it as such a deeply personal decision. And I think, if your employer, mandates the vaccine, I think there has to be a way to opt out for a legitimate reason. I think it has to be there. And if not, you agree that there will be like serious legal ramifications. I just don't see this going away anytime soon. I have legitimate concerns about it.
I mean, I would say that for private employers, that's a different story. Private employers, I think that's a serious concern about their freedom to run their businesses the way they want. It's a different story when you talk about the public sector with the state mandating it, certainly. And on the controversy of mRNA vaccines, I would say that they're actually, I would counter that they're not actually very controversial. They're very controversial in certain small circles, particularly on the right. And that's not to say that they aren't controversial in those circles, but more generally, I don't believe it's accurate to say that they are. And finally, I guess I would say that when we talk about, I mentioned the community responsibilities, I don't want anyone to get the impression I'm saying that I don't think that personal freedom is an issue here, because I absolutely do. And I agree that sometimes people on the progressive left downplay that. But what I'm saying is that in my view, that balance between responsibility to the community and personal freedom, oftentimes, especially on the right, tilts far too much in the area of personal freedom without sufficient concern for community responsibility. And I think you would probably agree with me that there was a balance that needs to be struck there, and that sometimes on the right, the tendency is to go too much into personal freedom, and on the left, maybe the tendency is to go into too much to community responsibility.
Oh, 100%. In fact, when you were, when you were just talking, I thought to myself, and I bet he basically counterbalances it and says that on the right, there are a lot of people who tend to look at the left and say that the balance is off, going in the opposite direction. And I think that's exactly the case here. And I think that's kind of at the root of all this. It's at the root of the politics of COVID is, this argument about personal responsibility versus, for the greater good, the public good, and, how much of what we need to do versus what we want to do, how much of that comes into play. And it's kind of like the never ending argument between progressives and conservatives. So, I guess we agree to disagree on that.
well, and going back to the sort of DeSantis case and the politics of it, the question I would have for you as somebody who has followed DeSantis more closely than I have over time, certainly, and you're right there on the ground and seeing the policy implications of the decisions that his government, his executive branch is making. What and how good of a job or bad of a job, in your estimation, would you say that DeSantis is doing? If you had to give him a grade on those A to F scales, what sort of grade would you give him?
On COVID or just in general?
Yeah, on COVID. Sorry.
On COVID, if I was looking at the past year and a half, I'd give him a B.
A B.
I'd give him a B. Yeah.
And what about DeSantis since the Delta variant, kind of the surge of the Delta variant?
I'd give him a B still.
Okay. All right. So
yeah, I don't think that would change. Maybe I'd have to think about it a little more, but yeah, it's hard. It's hard to think about things over the past 3 or 4 months versus everything that's happened over the last year and a half. There were plenty of points last year where I found myself questioning his decisions. Like you mentioned this idea of private enterprise and, policy affecting private businesses and things like that. I have some questions about that too. But overall, I think he's done a good job. I as a parent, my concerns are, about school, about children, about, the safety of vaccines, masks, and other COVID policies regarding kids. So I think to that end, I appreciate that he's put power, back in the hands of parents, although, here in Broward County, I guess that doesn't really apply. So I would give him a B, a fair B.
And I will give you the easiest question for you to answer. You won't have to be a great mind reader. What grade would I give him?
Oh, probably an F.
There you go. It would definitely be. It'd be one of those big red Fs. I'd pull out the bold pen and I would circle it a bunch of times and say, "See me after class." That would be the grade I'd give Ron DeSantis. But I know we need to move on. We have a lot of stuff. But before we do,
all the time.
Yeah, it happens. Before we do, we're just going to take a quick break and then we will be right back. All right, Kristen. So why don't we move on from our lengthy discussion, but I think, worthwhile discussion on COVID to talk a little bit about a non-COVID topic, that $3.5 trillion Senate budget agreement.
Yeah, COVID's always appropriate to talk about, especially when it comes to policy, but this is also appropriate. This made a lot of news this week. So the Senate passed a $3.5 trillion budget proposal. It was in a 50 to 49 party line vote in the Senate. And so I figured we would talk about what's in it, some of the potential long-term budgetary effects, as well as objections from both Republican senators and from some moderate Democratic senators about what is actually in the proposal. Either way, get ready for plenty of debate now that this first hurdle is cleared. This is not off the table. And then, of course, kind of, just to introduce the topic kind of related to that is the issue of consumer confidence, since we're talking about finance. This week, the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index fell by 13.5% in August, which is the third largest single month decline behind April 2020, which was the onset of COVID lockdowns, and then October 2008, which was prior to the Great Recession. So there's a lot of financial news this week. This $3.5 trillion budget proposal, definitely some blowback from some Democratic senators. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I would say as to the package itself, not that it will pass in this form. I don't think that's likely, but it will pass in some form. I really like what's in it. I mean, the main things I'm really happy about, higher taxes on the wealthy, over $400,000. I like that. Certainly a return to at least somewhat of the pre-Trump era on that. Adding dental, hearing, and vision coverage to Medicare. I like that. I like the idea of Medicaid expansion to those 12 Republican states that haven't done so yet under the ACA. Lowering prescription drug costs, universal pre-K, tuition-free community college, paid family and medical leave, hundreds of billions in climate change-related initiatives. And, I look at all, and obviously $3.5 trillion, there's a lot in there. And it seems to me that the reaction from liberals and conservatives, you could actually say it's the same reaction in the same sentence, because liberals, people like me are saying, this will make us a lot more like Western Europe. And conservatives saying, this will make us a lot more like Western Europe. It's like, yeah, let's go. Let's do it, I also point out that $3.5 trillion is a lot, but it's over a 10-year period. And if you take a look at that over a 10-year period, it amounts to maybe around 1% or so of U.S. GDP over that period, or right around. So I don't think it's necessarily as big of an potential inflation driver on its own as some people on the right fear. And I think there's this tendency to look at the headline number and not to realize that, well, no, actually, this is over, like so many of these things, over the period of a decade. And I think that's important to put that in that context. But my guess would be is you'd be much more in the camp of this will make us a lot more like Western Europe. Ugh, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, would this be the politics, guys, if I didn't try to counterbalance your argument with another argument?
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I thought that, well, first of all, let me say that this budget proposal is not surprising to me at all. President Biden has kind of shown himself to be, at least in my opinion and in the opinions of a lot of people on the right, a lot more progressive than he once was, and a lot more progressive than he was once thought to be. I think the Senate and the House, really, the Democratic senators and also Democratic House leadership and also representatives have, overall been marching to the left slowly. Certainly this is a continuation of, what was going on during the Obama administration, certainly during the Trump administration, and then now. It just so happens that I think a lot of what is in this proposal is going to be up for debate. Again, like you said, it's not going to pass like this. It never does. Budget proposals never do. Often they look quite different, at the end of the road versus at the start of the road. But obviously, I think there are a lot of progressive policies here that, raise a lot of eyebrows on the right. I think there's a lot of infrastructure talk that has been rightfully the source of a lot of ire of people on the right. I think that there are, I think that especially some of the concerns of like Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin, some of the more moderate Democrats, I think some of their concerns are valid, especially when it comes to infrastructure. And, the idea that, some of what's contained in this budget proposal is quite bloated. So, yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to begin, but yeah, I think you're exactly right. The thought of looking more like Europe is a pretty grim proposition for me and for a lot of people on the right. And I think for a lot of moderate Democrats as well.
Yeah, that reminds me of a quote this last week from Lindsey Graham, who said, You're putting in motion, I think, the demise of America as we know it. And I practically had to go to an optometrist if my eyes rolled so far back in my head after reading that. But that's, political rhetoric. So, but as you pointed out, that this is not going to happen in that format. I mean, Manchin and Sinema made it clear that they voted to allow for discussion, debate on this, but they are not going to be okay with voting for this in its final, this as the final sort of thing. I think that's pretty clear. But what's interesting to me is not so much the Senate dynamics on their own, but the Senate combined with the House dynamics, because of course progressives in the House are, want all this and more. One of the big disappointments to progressives is that this did not include lowering the eligibility age of Medicare to 60, as was being talked about at least earlier on, something I certainly would be a big fan of, but it's neither here nor there. But the Nancy Pelosi in the House right now is working with a 3-vote margin, and that gives a lot of power to a small number of members. And so we see that, for instance, House progressives are demanding that the House pass this package before that bipartisan infrastructure bill, in part so that moderate House Democrats won't, pass the infrastructure bill, then bail on this. And then, moderate House Democrats are demanding just the opposite for, again, similar, just reverse reasons. And I think it's going to be just politically kind of fascinating to see how Pelosi and how the House works out these dynamics, because I'm fairly certain of this. I'm fairly certain we're going to get the infrastructure bill that was passed a little while ago, essentially in the form that it was approved by the Senate. I'm also fairly certain we're going to get some sort of big budget bill. I think $2 trillion or more. But I don't pretend to be able to predict the order in which they're going to pass, or where the budget bill will end up landing, aside from the fact that I feel like it's going to be north of $2 trillion. But I just don't see the progressives walking away from a couple of $1 trillion in spending that they can get for programs they feel are vital, and I don't see moderates walking away from this deal either. So it's going to happen. To me, it's just a question of what the numbers are going to look like. Well, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to say that I can predict what's going to be in this at the end of the road versus now when it's a proposal and, it's being hotly debated. And, again, like you said, I think if hardcore progressives had their way, this would be a starting point for more. Like you said, you have, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coming out, Bernie Sanders coming out, a lot of people in both the House and the Senate a lot of progressives on both the House and the Senate coming out and basically saying, like, this is good, but it doesn't go far enough. And, I think the big question is in the past, that kind of ultra progressive wing of the Democratic Party, this is going to be a question of their influence. In the past, especially during the Trump administration, there were a few points where they made their case known and they had quite a bit of influence over, what was going on in the Senate, over Senator Schumer, over, obviously, Speaker Pelosi. They had quite a bit of influence over these, I guess, by comparison, more moderate senators and representatives on the left, which, again, it seems to be this kind of slow creep towards progressivism. But, I think it's going to be a question of whether or not, the squad and their, I guess their auxiliary members are going to be as influential as they have been in the past. It just depends. Sometimes they've been influential in the past. They've not been influential when it comes to budgetary matters. They've not historically been as influential as they have on, smaller matters. I think I agree with you. I think the infrastructure, the infrastructure legislation will pass, but, obviously I don't, I do think that it's going to be a pretty big proposal by the time we're done with it. I do think it's going to be north of $2 trillion. Whether or not I agree with it is a whole other thing, but, I think it'll pass, but I think it's going to look very different at the end of this road. And I'm curious to see whether some of the more moderate Democrats fall in line with kind of like that squad progressive faction in the House and in the Senate.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that the center of gravity in congressional Democrats has moved to the left, and as you pointed out earlier, that Joe Biden, who throughout his career has done a really good job of kind of triangulating where the center of his party is, has moved to the left as well. And to me, it's, I think a lot of people talk about the House Progressive Caucus and the Squad and so forth, and there are a lot of people in that group, right? But I also would point out that we see a similar thing on the right, because the last time I did the numbers, which is, I don't know, a week or so ago, the Republican Study Committee, which is the kind of conservative counterpart to the House Progressive Caucus, actually has a larger percentage of congressional Republicans than the House Progressive Caucus does of congressional Democrats. I think I said that correctly, which to me is just kind of a point of the larger issue of polarization in Congress and the incentives that drive that sort of thing, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. And, again, like as just somebody who's just really into, I love policy. It's kind of where my heart is, but I'm interested in politics, whether or not I find it repulsive. Sometimes I just feel so repelled by the politics of it all. And sometimes I'm so interested. One of the things I'm interested in is kind of like this, what's going on the left with this kind of progressivist push. And then this sort of like, it's kind of like two steps forward, one step back, or one step forward, two steps back, depending on the day. So, I mean, ever since, 2016, really, I've been very interested in 2018, those midterm elections. I've been very interested to see, where the Democratic Party ends up when all is said and done. Of course, it's always ongoing, but there seems to be this march to the left. And I'm curious to see whether, they're at this point in time, as progressive as the Democratic Party has become, if the more progressive people in that party are going to have their say, or whether it's kind of going to go back to like, the roots of people like Nancy Pelosi, for example, who, she has become more progressive, but she tends to be a little more middle of the road, obviously, than some of her more progressive counterparts. So I'm always interested in that kind of stuff.
my sense of the matter is, and this kind of shades into our next story, which we're going to get to shortly, is that once the Democrats lose both the House and the Senate in the midterms, and I think lose the House by a good margin, then there's going to be a lot more counter pressure on the most progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and that's what I think is almost inevitable. Certainly in the House, I'd say probably 80%, 90% chance that, the Republicans are going to regain the majority there. And I think it's going to happen in the Senate as well. And I think in part it's going to be because of, at least to a certain extent, because people have an issue with, if not progressivism in general, at least with how progressivism has been, I would say, successfully portrayed by the right as a really bad and evil sort of thing. But before we move on to that, Lester, I wanted to ask you, I didn't get a chance to talk to you about this, and Jay and I just missed it last week because of the timing, but on that earlier infrastructure vote, were you surprised that so many Senate Republicans, 19, voted for it, despite Donald Trump just coming out and just saying, this is not only bad, but I might have to give support to people who are opposing you in primaries and that kind of thing. I mean, 19 Republicans, that's bipartisan by anyone's measure of the term. And I guess this kind of ties into what we were talking about. Why I thought about it is because some people would be hopefully saying, well, see, that shows that in the end, Donald Trump is going to be a waning influence in the Republican Party when it really comes down to brass tacks. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I think there are two factors here. It's funny because when we were outlining the notes for the show, I was surprised that didn't come up. But it's something that I think there are two things worth considering when it comes to those 19 Republicans. I think the first thing you have to consider are who are those 19 Republicans, right? A lot of these Republicans, I just pulled up the list when you were talking now because I remembered a few, but I wanted to see all 19 of them. A lot of them have not been closely aligned with Donald Trump and with the people, I guess, his allies. You've got like, a lot of very middle of the road Republicans, a lot of, non-Trump supporting Republicans. I'm looking at Susan Collins of Maine. There is, Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who, he seems to go wherever the wind is blowing at the moment. And, I'm obviously very annoyed with Lindsey Graham and have been for a long time. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. What's interesting about Mitch McConnell is I think that he is also getting the sense, like you said, and this is my second point, that Trump's influence is starting to wane. I think he remains very much a figurehead in the Republican Party. I think he is, for a lot of kind of groups of Republicans, an ideological base. But I think what you're seeing is the Republican Party, certain groups in the Republican Party, particularly those who tend to swing more libertarian, kind of shifting their focus away from Donald Trump and his policies and, looking towards other ideological leaders. So I think, the Republican Party was very polarized before. It was either you were a Trump supporter or you weren't. And, there was very little room for people in the middle who, maybe supported Donald Trump but had criticisms like I did, or, vice versa, people who didn't support Donald Trump but maybe, supported some of his policies. I know a lot of people who fell into that position too. So, looking at this list, Murkowski, Mitt Romney, and another one, Tom Tillis. I mean, there are people on this list that I'm not surprised are on this list. So, I mean, just to give it a full picture, I think you have to look at these 19 on this list. But at the same time, I do think that this shows that he's maybe, that his star is fading a little bit. Maybe that he's being crowded out by other people that Republicans are looking to as ideological leaders. So, it's becoming more crowded, I guess, on the right.
I noticed I pulled up the same list that you did. And one thing I noticed that in looking at the 30 Republican no votes, there are some, I guess, somewhat surprising ones. And I think it's largely has to do with, I'm particularly talking about Marco Rubio, Ben Sass, those two stick out because immediately I think, yes, these are people who see themselves as the next president of the United States. And so this would be a good vote because certainly, Ben Sass is kind of about he's a pretty, or at least likes to position himself as kind of a moderate-ish Republican, and Rubio, I think, to an extent as well. And so I think to a number of senators, maybe that's political considerations for what they hope their next job is on that sort of thing. So
yeah, definitely. It's funny because I think that anytime, I don't think this necessarily happens, with Republicans. It happens with, once a Democratic president leaves office or is voted out or whatever. I think that anytime that happens, there's kind of like an identity crisis going on in that party, whichever party is, the one to not emerge victorious in the presidential election. And, I've seen it happen in the Democratic Party. We saw, I think a huge identity crisis in the Democratic Party between like 2016 and maybe 2018. Arguably, it's still going on to some extent with this march to the progressive left. But, I definitely see this going on in the right. I think, there are, like I've always said, there are different types of Republicans. It's not just one, shade of either black or white. It's very gray. And there are lots of different, people who, kind of have their hands and feet in different boxes on the Republican side. And, I think that, likewise, I think you're going to see a lot of people like, for example, Senator Marco Rubio, who's from here in South Florida. I think you're going to see him, kind of count his political cards first. And he's, like you said, he's thinking about his presidential aspirations. I think he's had them for a long time. And you see this playing out, I think, with some Republican governors too. It's kind of like, do I align myself with President Trump, or is that, like I said, a fading star? And should I, I guess like trudge out on my own or align myself with someone else? So yeah, I kind of feel like we're we've been shaken up right now, and it's going to be interesting to see, I guess, over the next year with midterm elections coming up next year, like where everything kind of falls and settles on the right. So,
and, kind of coming full circle, it seems to me, with Republican governors, you mentioned that the most clear example is somebody aligning himself with Trump or trying to be sort of a Trump with some of the roughest edges file down would be, in fact, your governor, Ron DeSantis.
DeSantis.
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think he's putting a lot of chips on that. And I think it might actually, if Donald Trump decides not to run himself, that I think he has a pretty strong chance at picking up that nomination. But it's a long ways off, that's for sure. Okay, so we had a lot we wanted to get to, and we're going to have to move that into our next bonus show, which again we are releasing at the same time for supporters on Patreon, and that includes talking about census data, which is a part of the reason why I think that Republicans are not quite a lock, but have a really strong chance of retaking the House, and that IPCC climate report, which got a lot of attention, and I think rightly so, and the Taliban's just totally just tearing through Afghanistan, surprising some folks, at least in the intelligence community, and maybe more than that. We'll see how much time we have. But before we do go and get into that, Kristen, I know you mentioned that you had some recommendations. I always like your recommendations. They're interesting, particularly interesting. I mean, not the J's and Trey's and Ken's are. I don't know. There's something about yours that I always really seem to like. So what do you got for us this week?
Oh man, so I actually have two. I'll go through them really quickly. So the first one is something that I think everybody would benefit by, because we're home more, we're ordering different things, we're ordering groceries, basically ordering everything and having it delivered to our home, no matter where you live in the country. And in my case, I'm a parent, so I'm kind of managing shipments for like 4 people in my household as opposed to just me. Although I think this would be good for everybody. So I downloaded something called the Shop app. Have you heard of it, Mike?
I have not, no.
The Shop app. Oh my gosh. So it's a free app. And you basically link up your different accounts, like your Amazon account or, similar, shopping, different shopping companies. You link those accounts, and it basically tells you in real time everything that's shipping to your address, when it's coming, where it is, kind of keeps track of everything all at once. It's sort of a random thing. Yeah, it's really cool. It's like one of the most useful things. It's definitely my most used app. But like it's one of the most useful things that I've gotten over probably the last couple of months. So yeah, it's very cool if you're somebody who likes to keep track of that stuff. And the other thing I wanted to recommend is a show, because I love recommending good shows. And so I highly, highly recommend a show. It was a British production that was, it's very, very timely now, but it was adapted or I guess purchased by AMC, and it's available now on Amazon Prime, and it's called The Salisbury Poisonings. And it's about, I don't know if you remember, Mike, I think it was back in 2018, there was a former Russian spy in the UK in Salisbury who was poisoned, and there was this like kind of all this news. Do you remember that?
Yeah, it sounds familiar. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was a story that kind of like came and went elsewhere in the world, but in the UK it was really big news. But there was this whole public health crisis, and it was all very, very real, and it preempted everything that happened with COVID about a year and a half later. And I thought it was so interesting. This so it's just a 4-part series. Like you could easily get through it in a weekend or something like that. And it is dramatized, but the acting is like, I've talked about Chernobyl, the acting in Chernobyl. Mm-hmm. It's like Chernobyl quality acting, and it's really good. It kind of goes through the timeline of events with these poisonings and kind of like the public health response. And actually, it made me feel a lot of empathy for people on the public health front. Their story isn't heard enough. So kind of like what they struggle with and their concerns. So I loved it. I thought it was great and very appealing. And it's a happy ending for most of the people affected by the poisonings. But yeah, interesting because it's a true story. And I highly recommend the series Salisbury Poisonings.
All right. Well, I guess I should throw in a couple of recommendations of myself quickly, and I will. One is I will do a show as well, and it's a show that I'm sure a lot of people have already seen, Bosch. It's kind of an old-fashioned, I like kind of old-school type of series because it's the main character, Harry Bosch. He's not a particularly tortured soul. He's not an anti-hero. To me, it kind of combines the best of old and new style TV. It kind of combines that season-long story arcs of modern crime shows with more of a, I guess you could say, an old-school sensibility. And I really kind of like that. Maybe that's just a sign of my age. I don't know, but I just finished binging the final season, and from start to finish, it was one of the most enjoyable shows that I've seen. I think actually it was the longest running Amazon show. And then something a little, I guess, different, a little kind of higher end, you could say. I'm just finishing up a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience by the philosopher, psychologist William James, written around the turn of the 20th century. William James is an amazing writer, an incredibly insightful guy. His brother Henry was a esteemed novelist. The whole family was just amazing, and it's a sort of a psychological, philosophic look at religion through William James's unique pragmatist lens, and it's opened my eyes and made me think about things in different. I've become a huge fan of William James. I've read a lot of him over this summer, and I definitely highly recommend that. Plus, it's old enough where it is free in public domain, though I ended up springing for the nice Library of America edition with the hardcover and the built-in little fabric bookmark and all that kind of stuff, because that's how I like to read books. But anyway, those are my recommendations for
Very
this
cool.
week. Yeah. And as always, if you would like to get that bonus show that Kristen and I will be doing in just a minute, you can either be a supporter of the show, patreon.com/politicsguys. If you can't afford to, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up to get that second episode. And if you haven't already subscribed to the show, left a rating or review, and especially if you could share episodes on social media, that's the best sort of advertising we can get. We would really, really appreciate it. If you just want to get in touch with us for any reason whatsoever, our email is mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and you will find links to that in our show notes. A special thanks to our most excellent executive producers of the Politics Guys: Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkerson, and Ryan Beasley. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.